All right. Hi there, everyone. Welcome to Tech Tuesday. My name is Tom Levine, and we're going to go ahead and get underway here. Today, we're going to be talking about some different types of technology and just generally some technical definitions. I found the best way to kind of get a good understanding for what we're covering is kind of to cover it question by question. So like if something's going wrong with your computer, what might be the reason for it, and just sort of explain what each of the definitions mean, not only by definition, but also how they relate to answering questions about your PC. So before we really get into things, though, let's start with housekeeping. First, if you have a question, please feel free to type it in the question box. There is a separate question box from a chat, but I'll be monitoring both. So don't worry if you put a question in the chat box. If I don't answer immediately, also, please don't worry. I promise I've seen it. I will get to it. If it's something that I think is relevant to what I'm talking about in the moment, then I will likely just answer it then. If not, then I'll probably wait till the end of the presentation. But either way, your questions will be answered. Also, if you don't feel like asking the question in the middle of the presentation, or you'd like to message me privately about your question, please feel free to do so. My email is tlevine@crnstone.com, and my direct line is 513-487-5390. Also, don't forget to sign up for AGB if you haven't yet. AGB is our broker digital suitcase, and it gives you access to your commission statements, to look at the book of business we have on file for you, and a lot more. If you have not done so yet, I'd recommend reaching out to us through our AGB support page on our site. There's a little question box there. It's www.crnstone.com/AGB, and I'll likely be the one to reply to your question. And last but not least, don't forget to look into our ASP services. This would be things like Autopilot, which is our client referral program. Let's say you want to help out one of your clients, but you don't have a product that they're looking for. Maybe we do. So if you kick them our way, then we might be able to help each other out. There's also succession planning, retirement assistance, and even service agreements where we can service your clients for you. So don't hesitate to look for more information about that at www.crnstone.com/what-we-offer/agency-services-program. The address is right there on the bottom of the screen. And I'm also going to just quickly type it into the chat box for you because it's kind of a long one. There we are. So without further ado, let's get into some of these computer definitions and issues. We're going to go ahead and actually start with kind of a summary of what your computer is overall. There are a lot of different components that go into this, and honestly, it does take a lot of time to really understand what sort of physical hardware glitches can cause a lot of actual computer issues. So we're going to go over it kind of briefly, but basically what's going on here is this thing up here in the corner is the power supply. This provides all the power to your computer. If it doesn't turn on initially, it's probably something going on with that. Additionally, there is our motherboard right here in the middle. It kind of holds all of the different components together. I'm gonna erase the drawings here real quick and actually change my pen color just to make it a little bit more visible. We're gonna use red. There's the CPU right here. It does all the thinking for the computer. Then there's RAM right over here. RAM is kind of like short-term memory. It's what allows your computer to multitask. There's a graphics card, although some computers do not have this. It's also called a video card. And what that does is it controls all of the actual visual signals going to your monitor. We'll cover this here in a minute as well. It can tie into some other issues. But if you were having some banding on your screen or something like that, the issue is probably related to your video card or graphics driver. Then we have a hard drive right here. Hard drive provides long-term storage and actually saves the programs that you use and the files that you use. So that would be this little floppy thing here. And then we have our CD-ROM drives and everything else up front, as well as the fan in the back, just to keep things cool. There's also typically another fan over top of the CPU, and that's also just to keep things cool as well. So those are all the hardware things, but honestly, hardware issues are probably the lowest percentage of issues that a technical person will cover. Maybe your computer's acting weird. Well, it's actually probably due to the peripherals or something else that's actually plugged into the machine, not the machine itself. The kind of things that you might have issue with the actual components of the computer are either related to the power supply or they're related to some sort of connection inside. The top 3 hardware issues that I looked up before this presentation was if your computer turns off quickly after it starts, that's likely due to overheating. And I've had that same issue in older PCs myself. Typically the fix for something like that, if it hasn't fried all of the internals of the computer yet, is to clear out all of the fans. That means the fan on the power supply, the fan out the rear. Typically there's an intake fan up at the front as well. Wipe it all down, clear it all out, clear all of the dust filters in the case, and then your computer will likely be fine. That's typically the most common issue for a computer just turning off immediately after it starts up and goes through its boot sequence. Also, if your computer doesn't turn on at all or go to a boot screen, then it's possibly a power supply issue. Could be that something came loose from the power supply to the motherboard. Could also be a general connection of a component. But typically 90% of the time, the power supply just died. And all that needs is a replacement. So if your computer's not turning on and your tech guy says, oh, it was the power supply, it's this box up in here. Typically, they can run between $200 and $300. Just depends on what type of power supply you need. That's for higher end computers, but lower end, you can probably get away with something around 100 to 150 bucks. And then the last of the hardware-related issues that we might have are if your computer turns on but has weird glitches or loading issues or programs just keep shutting down, stuff like that. Typically, that's related to either the CPU or the RAM. And that's actually kind of a much deeper diagnosis. That's kind of a larger scale problem. So if you're having weird program issues or something like that, it could be related to those 2 parts of the hardware, or it could be related to the software that you're running. And these sorts of things, it's really difficult to diagnose. So typically your IT guy will start with hardware, move on to software, and then see if there's some sort of compatibility issue with your device. So the next kind of top issue that people tend to have is with websites and web browsers, mainly not being able to log into a website that you've logged in before. There are a lot of different places out there that used to say, oh, you can only use Internet Explorer to log into this, or oh, you can only use Google Chrome. And that's kind of true, but not necessarily. In order to really answer the reasons of why that kind of a thing can happen, I feel like you kind of need a better understanding of what the internet is as a whole and how it operates. So that's kind of what we're doing here. First off, this diagram on the right-hand side is kind of a good little description of what exactly the internet is and how it works. If you've attended a few Tech Tuesdays before, you probably kind of already know some of this, but we're going to go ahead and cover it anyway. This right here is like your computer, this being your home computer and this being your business computer. Your computer connects to the networking hardware that you have in your office, be it a modem and router or a server with a router as part of it, which then connects you to your ISP. If you're working from home, then it's likely going to your actual subscriber direct, your local ISP direct from your home modem. From there, your local ISP reaches out to a regional ISP, and they reach out to the world ISP. This kind of jumps around a lot, and it's why if you send an email from your office, then it probably goes out to the World Wide Web before coming right back to you and then going to your coworker. So even inside the office, emails sometimes bounce around outside of your office. This has a few different IDs, and I thought I'd just cover some of the terminology here, just to demystify it. The first is your IP name. That's the actual name of your computer on the local network. So this computer right here is like HP something 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 presentation or whatever. That's the name that you see inside the office, and that's a name assigned to the IP address listed by the computer. All of these addresses are strings of numbers, and actually one of the parts of the regional ISPs and world ISPs is to connect to catalogs of those numbers compared to addresses. That's covered in domains, and we'll get there here in a second. Then there's the MAC ID, Media Access Control ID. That's the ID used by your modem or by your server to connect to the local ISP. Then there's the ISP itself, which is Internet Service Provider. This would be like your Spectrum, Cincinnati Bell, all of those types of people. And then finally, we're going to cover cables. Most of the time, if there's a connection problem or like you open up your web browser and it says cannot connect to internet and you're using a desktop PC, the reason is typically because of the cable that you're using to connect. This cable, I actually don't have an extra on me, but it comes out of the back of your computer and it connects into your wall socket typically, and it's the one that isn't connecting into the power line, but typically a hookup that looks kind of like an older phone line. That would be your CAT cable, and there are different types of CAT cables. There's Cat 5, Cat 5e, Cat 6, Cat 6e, which I didn't have listed because very few people use it, and Cat 7. Each of these higher numbers and adding an e to it, that just means that it can handle more speed. A Cat 5 cable can't handle as much internet speed or traffic as a Cat 7 cable. The Cat 6 cable can't handle as much as a Cat 7, but a Cat 6 can handle more than a Cat 5 or a Cat 5e. So the number scheming can also help determine your internet speed. But most people are fine with just a Cat 5e cable, regular old router, and that's basically how the internet overall works. Once you get up to the world ISP level, it jumps back down to the website you're requesting, and then your traffic goes back to you from there. So that's kind of how computer networks work in a nutshell as well. I know what you're saying, but that doesn't answer why all sites don't work on my browser. Well, I promise we're getting there. Just a few more things for you to know first. First is URL. URLs are kind of something that everyone kind of knows what they are, but doesn't really know what they are. The URL is the address of your web page, and it's kind of what I was talking about when I said we'd get into domains in a moment. A URL is the text address of a website. For ours, that's www.crnstone.com. I'm just going to go ahead and underline it here. This would be the URL of Cornerstone's website. The URL is the text definition of the actual IP of the server that our website is run on. So if you type in crnstone.com, your traffic goes from your computer to your modem to your local ISP. The local ISP says, oh, they're looking for crnstone.com, sends it off to the regional ISP, who sends it off to a database of all of the different domains and all of the different numbers that actually correspond to those domains. It searches, figures out that crnstone.com is trying to connect to our server here in the office, and then directs your traffic to the world ISP and gives them the address of where you're trying to go. That world ISP then connects to the closest regional ISP for our web address, which then sends the traffic to the local ISP for our web address, and then sends that information back to our server. That server then sends what information you're trying to access back to you by following the exact path that it went, and now you're back here at your computer and you have access to our website. So that's really what a URL is doing, and when you type it into your web browser, what it means. Additionally, I just wanted to cover that the domain is also that address listed here at the very end of an email inbox. That's because email inboxes are hosted on the web and all the information is stored on servers. So whenever you access your email address or whenever you send or receive an email address, that little icon there at the end, the domain, is also something to pay attention to. It's why a lot of people end up getting scammed by, hackers pretending to be Anthem, because instead of coming in from, anthem.com, it'll come in from a misspelled version of Anthem. It'll be like ANTHME or something like that, and it's very simple to ignore. So my recommendation is just to pay attention to that when you're sending emails as well. I also wanted to mention that HTML is the language used to code websites. So if you go onto a website and there's just a weird glitchy issue with it or something's wrong, it's probably something in the HTML code. So now that we know all of that, why don't all sites work on all browsers? And that's kind of our core question. HTML is not all that's used on websites anymore. There are other sorts of code that run on websites. There's JavaScript, there's a whole lot of different things. And each web browser interprets that data differently. While all of them can read HTML, not all of them are set up to be compatible with all languages on the web, and not all cookies, honestly, as well. Each web browser will interpret that data that is being sent to it from the web page slightly differently. Now, that's because of codecs. And codecs are just tiny snippets of code run by your web browser that will encrypt and decrypt data for the transmission of information on the web. If your web browser doesn't have the codec that the website is using, then typically it'll lead to different errors. It might not, have a weird display on the page, but it might not let you log in. It also might not let you see your, login box at all. These are generally the reasons why not all browsers are compatible with all websites. And it's one of the problems that we see, if you're using a really weird one. That being said, a lot of this is generally fixed nowadays. A lot of websites are coded to kind of allow a lot of different web browsers access. If you use Chrome, then Microsoft Edge will work just as well as Chrome will nowadays. And the reason for that is because Microsoft Edge is based off of the same engine that runs that runs Google Chrome. So that's kind of why most sites that are compatible with Google Chrome will be compatible with Microsoft Edge. Additionally, Firefox is pretty much the same way. It's up to date on all the same codecs. So if you run any of those three browsers, you likely won't see any issues. Aetna was a good example of a site that only worked on Internet Explorer for a while. And that was because a lot of their codecs were out of date. Internet Explorer got completely cut off about a month ago, if you don't know, which means Microsoft no longer supports it. There are no longer going to be any updates for it. And I'd highly recommend moving to Microsoft Edge if you still use Internet Explorer for a lot of different things. That said, there are some fixes to this. If a website was working just fine on your web browser before, then there are a few different things you could do. The first is to clear your cookies. And what cookies are tiny little pieces of code. We'll get into a more direct definition of what this is here on the next slide. But basically, by clearing your cookies, you are making sure that you're compatible with the most recent version of the website. And that's why clearing your cookies will allow, different types of issues with websites to be resolved. Another fix you could use is to use a different web browser to access the content. If something doesn't work for Firefox, I tend to use Microsoft Edge. And then whatever doesn't work on Microsoft Edge, I'll use Firefox for. Firefox is my default browser, but Edge is my backup just for compatibility reasons. But there is another way to fix it. A lot of times there's a web store with part of your browser, and one of the things you can do is actually get codecs added to your browser as add-ons. That also typically fixes a lot of different compatibility issues with older sites, because you can just download the proper codec needed for your web browser, and then you're good. The problem is a lot of websites don't actually show you the issues with this, so it's not very helpful. You have to kind of pick and choose which codecs you need, unless you know how to get into developer mode of the website, which a lot of people don't. So as promised, we're going to cover cookies next, but let's go ahead and talk a little bit more about some of the online activity here. We've only got 2 more slides left for internet stuff, I promise. The first being just some general definitions you might need to know while using the internet. First off is cookies, because as I said, we would cover it immediately. Cookies are small pieces of code used by your computer and websites you go to track what you do online. Now, this can be a good thing and a bad thing, and there are 3 different types of cookies. There's third-party cookies, which are just kind of the worst. If you see a third-party cookie on your machine, I personally tend to just delete them. You can typically see all your cookies if you go into the settings of whatever web browser you're using. And if you don't recognize one, I tend to just clear it out. A lot of times an IT person, if you're calling into like Aetna's website, will say, well, have you tried clearing cookies? And that's kind of the first thing that IT people tell you to do if you're having trouble accessing a website, besides ask which browser you're using. The reason for this is that as websites update, those cookies don't also automatically get updated. Now, websites use cookies to do things like autofill your passwords and autofill in some additional information just by identifying, oh, this is this person's computer, but they also use it to track your history. Amazon is using cookies as we speak, probably, to track the last thing that you looked at on their webpage and seeing how long it takes for you to maybe complete your cart. It's how they track to see, oh, okay, this person logged in, viewed a bunch of things like, like sunscreens or whatever, and then recommends you a bunch of other sunscreens because you were looking at them. That's kind of what cookies are used for. The problem is with site updates, the cookies that get updated are not always automatically updated on your PC. So the next time you go back to Amazon after they do a big update and change the way their cookies are coded, it can sometimes not mesh with the site anymore because of site-side changes. Because of those changes, then the website breaks, and that's why IT people ask you to change your cookies. Typically, you'll see issues with this after the website has a small update, and they likely won't even tell you. So if a site was working on your machine, but now it isn't, my recommendation is just clear out the cookies from that website. Another issue, if you're trying to connect to a server, like a company server, and you're not getting through, is to check your VPN. VPNs are virtual private networks, and it's completely required if you're going to try to work remotely here in healthcare. Now, the reason for that is because a VPN is a virtual private network. Basically, it kind of creates a secure communication line between your computer, where you are, and the computer you're accessing at your office. So people don't really see what's going on between you and that computer talking. In fact, the only thing they could really monitor is what's coming out of the computer you're connected to, not you itself. It's also why a lot of commercial VPN companies who market to individuals recommend that you use their service to pretend to be in like Austria to get Austrian Netflix, or you can kind of jump all over the world and no one will really know where you're browsing from. It's pretty neat, actually. Essentially, what happens is if someone tries to monitor your connection and you're connected to a VPN, they won't be able to see what you're talking to that server with at all. It's completely encrypted. Additionally, the internet or whoever is listening in would only be able to see requests the server is making to different sites. So they wouldn't be able to see what you're looking at. And that's only if they're monitoring the outgoing traffic on the server you're trying to connect to, which is typically heavily secured. So there's not really much of a way for them to get into that. It's why we require them here in our office as well. So that kind of covers all of the main internet issues that people could have. But I just wanted to cover one more, and I get asked about this a lot inside of my office as well. First off, it's these site unsafe notices that you see. Now, this notice on the right is something that I actually see pop up on my computer sometimes. It just says proceed with caution, changing advanced configuration preferences can impact Firefox performance settings. Typically, it'll say something along those lines, or also like warning this site is unsecure, proceed at your own risk, and it'll have that button there that says accept the risk and continue. The reason that you see these issues are typically because the site you're trying to access doesn't have an up-to-date SSL certificate. And those are certificates are basically encryption protocols run on the site. To explain that in non-tech, it jumbles the signal going between your computer and the website itself, kind of like that VPN does. The reason for this is because as hackers get more and more sophisticated, you want to encrypt the data that's being talked about between your computer and website. It just adds another level of safety. but it is pretty much required for all businesses to have some sort of SSL certificate for their website. If you look at ours as well now, you'll see this little S, and I'm going to circle that here, by HTTP in the web address. And that's just telling you that we're using a secured SSL certificate when you access our website. That's kind of what that S means. You can also see that it's a secured connection by looking at the lock next to your URL. That lock also shows that communication is being encrypted between you and the website. The SSL cert is what causes these errors to appear, and the reason is there probably isn't one being used on the site, or the site admin just let it expire. There are a lot of different reasons for this, and we've actually had our SSL certificate expire here once or twice before. Really, all it is updating the protocols being used and reapplying for that certificate for that kind of notice to be resolved. It's not something that can be fixed on your end, and it's not an issue with your computer. It stands for Secure Socket Layer. It's similar to TLS, which is kind of a more advanced protection service. And if it's just not enabled on sites, you'll see that issue. Typically, it's not a problem. And if you're trying to access a website that doesn't involve transmitting secure information, so any sort of non-healthcare related site or non-banking related site, then really it's probably not that big of a deal and you're probably okay to move on. The issues you really should be looking at is if you see a pop-up on your computer, like this one, but it says like this site has been known to engage in risky activity, or oh, this website is, identified in our registrar as one with viruses, and then you should really be wary. But just an issue here with this pop-up saying something like, oh, this site is insecure, that's not necessarily a bad thing. It just means that the website isn't using a encrypted communication with you. So if you're comfortable viewing the content unencrypted, you can continue. If not, then you would just move on. Don't use the site. So moving back kind of into hardware issues, another common issue that I see, or at least that I get asked about a lot, is, a flickering screen, or, my monitor is having some banding issues. And there are a few different common reasons that this can happen. At the beginning, we talked about graphics cards, and we'll get more into detail about that in a moment. But more often than not, the issue is actually the cable being plugged in from your computer to your monitor. Now, there are a few different types of main cables being used. A lot of older monitors use this blue connector right over here. Now, this blue connector is called a VGA cable, and it's pretty secure. Typically, you have to screw in these little screw mounts back here into holes on the receiving end. All of these cables that I'm showing here are extenders, so they have a male end and a female end on them. This sort of shows you how you know what plugs into what on the back of your computer and into the monitor. Most cables will have two male ends, and that would be this one over here. In IT, they're called the male end because they have the part that sticks out. And basically what happens is you plug it into your computer, plug it into the monitor, and then make sure the connections are tight. If you have like weird cutouts in your screen, like it goes black and back to normal, black back to normal, or you just see the image kind of stuttering a lot, that's because of the way this cable is pushed into your monitor or into your computer. And the first thing I would do before calling IT is just push on those connectors a little bit, try to get them in a bit more solid. Additionally, there are a few other types of cables that are used, and I'm just going to cover what they're called. First is DVI, which is this chunkier looking cable over here. There are a few different types of DVI cables. Some of these internals will have a plus right here instead of a minus sign. Some of them will have a gap here in the pins. All of those are DVI cables. There are a few different types, but normally one DVI cable will work in another DVI cable's port and vice versa. You just want to make sure you have a matching type of DVI cable, and it should work. This is kind of the most updated one, and it'll work in almost all devices that require a DVI connection. And next slide, I'm going to show you a monitor and kind of walk through what the backs of these might look like as well when you're using them. The third most common connector, though, is this one right up here, and probably everyone's seen them if they own a TV. It's an HDMI cable. HDMI is kind of being used now more standardized for most devices, and you probably have an HDMI cable used to plug your computer into your monitor if you're running a more recent type of machine. The last one I wanted to cover is Displayport, and it's kind of like HDMI. The only real difference as far as the physical look of the plug is the way it's slanted, and a lot of people confuse these Displayport cables for DVI cables, or not DVI, I apologize, HDMI. And the reason for that is just how similar they look. You can tell the ports apart because an HDMI port or receiving end will have two of these little dips on them, and a DVI cable will just have one of these little cutouts on them here in the receiving end. DVI has more resolution than HDMI. If you're using a 4K TV, you really probably should be using a DisplayPort connection to plug into it. It just transmits more data back and forth between the screen and the video source. So those are kind of all the different slides that are related to that. But let's go ahead and show the back of a monitor real quick as well. As you can see, there are some ports back here, and I just kind of wanted to cover what it would look like to try and figure out which connection might be causing your issue. If you look over here, this is the HDMI plug, and a lot of computers or monitors will look kind of similar to this. If you have something plugged in here, just wiggle it about a little bit, and that'll typically fix your banding issue. Additionally, there's the DVI port right there. It's an optional connection, and a VGA port right back here. Now, one thing to note is you can actually have multiple devices plugged into a monitor at once. You can have maybe 3 different computers all plugged in using different inputs, and you can swap back and forth to the input on the monitor to kind of change what you're looking at. If you have a lot of different computers that you use in only one monitor, then you might want to just use different plugs for each of them and turn one on when you're using it, turn it off, turn on the next one, and so on and so forth. Additionally, if your monitor is just randomly shutting down, the first thing I'd check is the power plug on the back, and that'll look something like that. So the other issue that could be causing it, though, if you've checked all your actual inputs and you're still getting banding issues when you use a certain program, or you're still having problems with it, then you might not have the driver installed for that device. So what is a driver? Well, a driver is a type of firmware, and firmware is kind of a weird thing, so let's get into it a little bit. There are 3 types of hardware and not hardware, but 3 types of components to a computer. That's probably a better way to phrase it. There's software, which is all the programs that run on your PC. It's all the things you can't actually touch about your computer. Then there is hardware. Hardware is stuff that you can touch that is related to your computer. All of the stuff that we were covering on the first slide of this presentation, that was hardware. The actual case, that's hardware. The screen that you're using, that's hardware. So anything that is physically, connected or a part of your computer, that's considered hardware. And then there's firmware. Firmware is a little strange because it's typically a mix of hardware and software. A good example of this is your computer's BIOS, which is kind of the system that actually starts your computer. It gets electrical impulses from your power supply that tells the computer how to start up and start thinking. Another good example of firmware, however, is driver software. Driver software is software that tells your computer how to interpret signals from a physical device. It's how your computer knows, okay, these 1s and 0s correspond to a flicker in this bulb on this screen, or this little diode. It's essentially what tells your computer how to make your screens work and how to make pretty much anything plugged into your computer work. If a IT person said, oh, you were missing a driver, so I installed it, that just means they told your computer how to work with what it was plugged into. Drivers are really kind of crucial. They typically automatically install nowadays if you plug in a device, but sometimes it doesn't automatically, and that can cause different issues. If everything is connected well and everything seems to be operating, to what you can tell, well, it's probably a driver issue. And you can just say, hey, I wiggled the cables on the back of my computer. I'm still getting these weird graphical issues. It's probably some sort of driver issue. Would you please check and install it or update it? And the IT person will probably just check that first. If you still have issues after checking all of your connections to your monitor and after checking the driver software, then the issue is likely in your graphics card or your graphics driver for your computer. And typically, the first fix is just to uninstall and reinstall the driver software. And then the second fix is to see if there's something wrong with the actual card itself. That can be a more expensive fix, so it's something that you would try to avoid or diagnose last. So finally, we're going to be covering our last little topic here is what an issue might be if you can't connect to a cloud. So it's helpful to understand what the cloud is to understand kind of what the problem might be here. A cloud is basically a computer that's somewhere else. A lot of cloud systems are actually called cloud servers, and the reason for that is because they actually are servers. All the cloud is a computer somewhere else processing your data and saving it. This involves some things called network drives. And network drives are basically like hard drives, but they're located on servers. Data can be stored across multiple hard drives or networked drives in order to actually save information to a cloud. If you have a kind of common repository for information in your office, and like everyone saves to a specific location, here we have something kind of similar implemented, then that's likely a network drive or a cloud network drive. Another thing that I wanted to kind of mention here briefly, if you ever heard of it, is VMware. VMware is a type of partitioning software, which translates to splitting up a computer's resources. Basically, servers are very complicated beasts, and when you say create a cloud account, a VMware instance is run up on that server. And what it does is it partitions a set of data from that server for you directly. So let's say that I went out and bought a Google Drive space. What would happen is the VMware would partition a space on Google servers for me. It would say, Tom now has 500 megabytes or whatever of storage that I pay for, and it would be stored across several network drives that are plugged into their servers. So that being said, what's the problem here? What if you can't connect to a cloud? Well, the first thing that I would check is your internet connection. Try opening up a web browser. If that doesn't connect as well, then maybe you're having general internet issues. You might want to check the plugs for the CAT cables on the back of your computer and the wall that is plugged into, or if it's plugged directly into your router, then check that plug too. Then check the plug between the router and the modem. If all of this stuff is, connected and working, and your computer is saying, yes, you are connected to the internet and you can get out to other sites, then I would move on to my second issue, which is a login or VPN issue. Some servers require you to be using a VPN to access them, and thus the same sort of thing is required for the cloud. If you're accessing a storage drive on a remote server and you require a VPN to access it, but it's not letting you through, check the VPN. Typically, you're either not logged into that or you're not logged into the profile that you need to access that information. Now, if all of those things check out, you're logged in, you're all set, then I move on to step 3. Typically, it's some kind of permission issue, or maybe the server's down. That's when you call IT, and that's when you'd say, hey, I can't connect to this. I don't know what's going on. Can you help? If they say, oh, that's really weird, check a few things. It takes about a minute and say, okay, try now. The issue is probably with the server or your data permission. Basically, everyone who logs into a server has a set of things they can do on that server. They can read files, they can save files, they can write and create files. But typically, if you can't access the server, that means your permission was revoked for some reason. A lot of companies have automatic renewal. So it'll be something like, okay, you're given this permission for X amount of time. And then after that amount of time elapses, then you're turned off. Most of these things have automatic updates, so you're automatically turned back on. But if that kind of a system is in use, but if it isn't, then there are a lot of different things that could cause that. Maybe a switch got flipped, someone accidentally edited your profile who didn't mean to. There are a lot of different issues. But if the person you're talking to still says, okay, everything's set up here right on our end, something must be going on with you, then it's possible that you might be hacked. If you try to open up your drive and you see a little notice that says, hey, reach out to this location and wire me money, then you're probably infected with ransomware and you probably shouldn't be trying to connect to that server anymore anyway. It likely means that the server itself was hacked, and you're probably in a much worse situation than anything that I could cover here could help resolve, unfortunately. Now, I will say we covered a lot of, specific things and kind of minor troubleshooting issues here. And in part of this presentation, I also created a general repository of terms here at the end. These are just all the general networking terms we covered, all of the different desktop and device terms we covered, as well as all the different server and data storage related terms that we covered. Now, all of these are available from the handout that I actually attached here as well. And if you check under the handout section, you should see a file called TT Tech Talk Presentation Handout. That's an exact copy of this presentation along with all of these data terms. So if you want to review this or need to go over something again and aren't sure what I said, you can check this handout and you can get a general definition of what's going on with it. Additionally, if you have any other questions or comments, now's the time. I'm always happy to answer questions, and I take a look at a lot of different types of tech issues. So if you have a weird problem that you're trying to troubleshoot, you can put that in here as well. I'll be sticking around for a little bit, but if you choose to sign out, hope you've had a great Tech Tuesday and have a wonderful day. Thank you.